The Western may be built on dusty trails and cowboy legends, but in the 1,970 seconds, it went places nobody expected. The gunsmoke cleared, and what stared back was violence so raw that even censors slammed the brakes. Forget about polite saloon duels. These films showed a West dripping with grit, chaos, and scenes that made audiences flinch. Are you ready to ride into the outlaw side of the genre? Hold tight, this list doesn't play nice. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, 1973. The outlaw myth stripped bare. That's what Sam Peckinpah delivered in Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, a film that was as much a funeral for the classic Western as it was a story about two men caught in history's grip. Peckinpah had already rattled the industry with The Wild Bunch, but here he turned elegy into spectacle, making violence linger long after the bullets stopped. James Coburn's Garrett, hired to track down his old friend, and Chris Christopherson's Billy, defiant and reckless, play their parts like men already haunted. The brutality is unflinching. Long, grim shootouts, staged not as heroic climaxes, but as slow, bloody collapses of a dying frontier. Scenes were trimmed, re-edited, even yanked away from Peckinpah in the cutting room because the studio feared the intensity. What made it worse for nervous executives was the way the violence came packaged with Bob Dylan's melancholy soundtrack, forcing audiences to feel every ounce of tragedy. Censors hacked away at certain shots to soften the impact, but even stripped, the film remained a tough watch for 1,973 viewers. Critics were divided. Some hailed it as poetry, others dismissed it as excess. Decades later, restored versions proved Peckinpah's point. The Old West was no place for fairy tales. Watching it now, you see more than just grit. You see a director refusing to clean up history. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid wasn't just censored, it was wrestled into something safer. Yet even in its broken form, it still cuts deep. This was Peckinpah saying goodbye to the genre, and goodbye never looked so violent. Cutthroats, 9,972. Imagine a Western crossed with a nightmare. That's Cutthroats 9, a Spanish Western so vicious that even grindhouse regulars left unsettled. Marketed like a traditional outlaw chase, what audiences got instead was cruelty on a level rarely seen in the genre. The story follows a chain gang being transported through snowy mountains after a heist gone wrong. Shackled together, the convicts turn on each other in ways that shocked censors and left audiences horrified. Scenes of betrayal, torture, and grim survival weren't stylized or hidden behind shadows, they were dragged into the light. No noble cowboys, no sense of honor, just a steady descent into chaos. What rattled regulators wasn't just the quantity of blood, but the tone. The violence felt clinical, drawn out, and designed to unsettle rather than entertain. When it premiered, some theaters marketed it as a horror film to prepare audiences for what they were about to see. Cuts were ordered in multiple countries, with certain reels literally spliced apart to keep the film from being banned outright. Decades later, Cutthroats 9 built a reputation as one of the most disturbing westerns ever filmed. While many 70 seconds westerns pushed boundaries, few matched its sheer bleakness. It's the kind of movie that makes even hardened genre fans pause and wonder how far is too far. For anyone expecting the sweeping deserts and dusty heroics of John Wayne, Cutthroats 9 slammed the door shut. It showed the dark side of the frontier, and once you've seen it, you can't forget it. Black Killer, 1971. The spaghetti westerns were never shy about violence, but Black Killer took it to another level, mixing pulpy thrills with cruelty so sharp that censors had no choice but to step in. Directed by Carlo Crocollo, it presented a frontier dripping in corruption, where the law itself was little more than a weapon. The plot centers on a mysterious lawyer arriving in a town under siege by bandits. But this isn't a tale of justice triumphing over evil. Instead, it's about betrayal layered on betrayal, and the executions that follow are filmed with a brutal eye. Victims don't fall in glamorous standoffs, they writhe, they suffer, and the camera doesn't look away. Italian censors slashed certain sequences before release, while other markets received watered-down edits to make it palatable. Still, Word spread quickly. This wasn't a traditional Western, it was a raw display of how ugly frontier life could get when greed ran the show. Even TV cuts decades later struggled to hide its darker streaks, chopping out so much that the story barely made sense. Black Killer is important because it showed how the Western could function as something more than action. It became a mirror of cynicism. Nothing is clean here. The violence doesn't reset the balance of the town, it deepens the corruption. That was too bitter a pill for many censors to swallow in the 1,970 seconds when Westerns still carried an air of family-friendly adventure. For fans today, Black Killer stands as proof that spaghetti Westerns weren't afraid to spill more than just style, they dragged you through the dirt. Kioma, 1,976. Franco Nero with a shotgun in hand, framed against a stormy sky. Iconic. Kioma is one of the defining revisionist Westerns of the 70 seconds, but also one of the most censored. It's a tale that bleeds myth and brutality in equal measure. Kioma tells the story of a half-breed gunslinger returning home after the Civil War, only to find his town rotting under tyranny. What unfolds is less a plot-driven adventure than a fever dream. The violence is operatic, slow-motion battles drenched in blood, prolonged duels where every fall feels catastrophic. Censors in multiple countries recoiled, slicing away chunks of the finale, where bodies collapse in drawn-out ballets of suffering. What set Kioma apart wasn't just the visuals, but the tone. This was violence as poetry. Director Enzo G. Castellari staged every moment like a tragic dance, forcing viewers to witness the destruction of a man trying to cling to his humanity. Yet, the very thing that made it powerful also made it unfit for family-friendly audiences. Television networks hacked the film into near incoherence, stripping away the very scenes that defined its artistry. Critics at the time were baffled. Was Kioma a masterpiece or an indulgence in excess? Fans didn't care. For them, it became a cult classic, celebrated for its raw nerve and Franco Nero's weary performance. Even with censors trying to bury it under cuts, Kioma endured. Watching it now, you realize why it rattled regulators. It doesn't hide behind myth, it shows the West as a tragic wasteland, and sometimes that was too much honesty for the 1,970 seconds to handle. Sonora, A Man Called Apocalypse, Joe, 1,970, a Western that looked like it came from another planet. Sonora, also known as A Man Called Apocalypse Joe, is one of the strangest yet most censored entries of the decade. What started as a spaghetti Western quickly spiraled into surreal territory, mixing comedy, violence, and psychedelic visuals that left audiences divided. The story follows Joe, a drifter inheriting land in a corrupt town. But instead of a straightforward tale of justice, the film veers into surreal staging with dreamlike colors and violence that feels almost theatrical. Yet beneath the odd visuals, the cruelty was very real. Drawn-out duels, brutal ambushes, and lingering shots that made regulators uneasy. In Italy, entire sections were trimmed, including sequences where characters were dispatched in prolonged, unsettling fashion. Abroad, the film was slapped with harsh ratings, keeping it from wide release. Even re-releases often toned down the content, making original uncut versions rare for years. What's fascinating about Sonora is how it merged style with violence. It wasn't just the bloodshed that rattled people, it was how it was presented, otherworldly, disorienting, and sometimes darkly comic. Instead of softening the edges, the bizarre tone made the cruelty land even harder. For censors, Sonora was a nightmare. For fans of offbeat cinema, it became a hidden treasure, a film that dared to break not just Western rules, but cinematic ones. Today, it stands as one of the wildest reminders that in the 70 seconds, the genre was willing to push boundaries far past the horizon. A Bullet for Sandoval, 1,970. Love, betrayal, and blood. This one had it all. A Bullet for Sandoval wasn't just another spaghetti Western, it was a tragedy disguised as a shootout. George Hilton stars as John Warner, a man who abandons the Confederate Army only to find his family turned against him. What follows is a spiral of grief, desperation, and violence that censors tried their best to contain. The film is unapologetically bleak. Warner's lover dies in childbirth, his son doesn't survive, and his in-laws reject him. That grief hardens into fury, and the rest of the film unfolds like a storm of retribution. Shootouts stretch out longer than audiences were used to, and every casualty carries emotional weight. Unlike traditional westerns, there's no clear line between good and evil here, just raw survival, often shown with unsettling detail. Censors trimmed parts of the massacre sequences, especially those that lingered on suffering. Television versions became even more fragmented, removing so much that the story felt like a patchwork. Yet even gutted, the film's despair shone through. Viewers left not cheering for justice, but stunned by the sheer hopelessness of Warner's journey. Why did it stand out? Because A Bullet for Sandoval showed the cost of vengeance without softening the blow. It wasn't escapism, it was a cautionary tale about what happens when grief curdles into rage. For 1,970 audiences, that was a line too far, and for censors, it was a nightmare to package. Even today, it remains one of the most gut-wrenching westerns of its era. For of the Apocalypse 1975, Lucio Fulci, the master of horror, turned his gaze to the Old West. The result? For of the Apocalypse, a film so brutal and strange that even hardened audiences found themselves shaken. Spaghetti westerns were already famous for their grit, but Fulci dragged the genre into the mud and left it there. The story follows four outcasts: an accused card sharp, a pregnant woman, a drunk, and a fool, wandering through a wasteland after a massacre. Sounds quirky? Not for long. They cross paths with a sadistic outlaw played by Tomas Milian, and that's when the film slides into nightmare territory. Fulci doesn't hold back. The cruelty isn't quick or stylized. It lingers, leaving you squirming with every frame. Censors in multiple countries slashed entire sequences, especially those showing humiliation and drawn-out suffering. Some cuts were so severe that the narrative lost its rhythm. Even softened, though, the movie carried a reputation for being one of the harshest westerns ever produced. Critics were baffled. Was it exploitation, or was it Fulci's twisted meditation on survival? Fans, meanwhile, recognized it as something different. A western with the heart of a horror film. What makes For of the Apocalypse unforgettable is its refusal to give audiences comfort. There are no heroes, no satisfying resolutions, only people crushed under the weight of cruelty. For 1,972 censors, that was too bleak to tolerate. For us today, it stands as a testament to just how far the Western could go when pushed to its limits. Massacre Time, 1970. When a Western crosses into pure brutality, you know censors are waiting with scissors. Massacre Time, another film directed by Lucio Fulci, started life as a straightforward revenge tale. But its most infamous sequences, particularly one involving whip torture, turned it into a lightning rod for controversy during its 1,972nd re-release. The film follows a prospector, played by Franco Nero, who returns home to find his family land stolen and his loved ones targeted. What could have been a standard spaghetti western revenge setup spirals into a barrage of cruelty. Villains don't just fight, they humiliate, dragging out punishments in scenes that were too much for regulators. During its initial run in the late 60 seconds, the film slipped under the radar. But when it resurfaced in the 70 seconds, international markets cracked down hard. The whip sequence in particular was chopped into fragments, with some countries removing it altogether. Television edits often gutted the second act, making the film nearly incoherent. Yet beneath the controversy lies a surprisingly sharp story. Massacre Time isn't just about vengeance. It's about the corruption of power and the cost of confronting it. Every cut by the censors only highlighted just how raw Fulci's vision had been. For audiences, the film was a reminder that the Old West wasn't a place of clean duels, it was a world of cruelty where the strong crushed the weak. Massacre Time proved that sometimes what censors fear most isn't blood itself, but how it's used to expose human ugliness. China 9. Liberty 3, 71978, a Western with a strange mix of poetry and brutality. Directed by Monte Hellman, China 9, Liberty 37 took the classic outlaw tale and soaked it in grit, sensuality, and violence. That combination pushed censors into overdrive. The plot follows a condemned gunman offered freedom if he kills a fellow rancher. But instead of a straightforward hit job, the story spins into betrayal, unexpected alliances, and a trail of violence that refuses to let go. What rattled regulators was how the film balanced beauty with brutality. Sweeping landscapes cut against close-ups of bloodied confrontations, making the violence harder to ignore. Different countries hacked away at different pieces. Some trimmed the intimate scenes, others the shootouts, and a few did both, leaving wildly different versions floating around. American television airings often sliced entire subplots, reducing the film to little more than a sequence of brawls and double crosses. Critics were divided. Some praised its haunting style, while others dismissed it as indulgent excess. What makes China 9 Liberty 37 stand out is its refusal to sit neatly in one box. It's part art film, part pulp, and completely unapologetic. The violence doesn't feel like a backdrop, it feels like an unavoidable fate, grinding down everyone involved. For censors, that fatalism was too strong. For audiences, it's what turned the film into a cult classic. Watching it today, you realize Hellman wasn't just making a Western, he was crafting a requiem. And requiems don't play by the rules. Get Mean, 1975. When spaghetti westerns went weird, they went really weird. Get Mean is proof. A film so bizarre and so violent in parts that censors didn't know whether to laugh, cut, or ban it. Starring Tony Anthony as the Stranger, this wasn't your average dusty showdown. The plot is outlandish. A wandering anti-hero gets caught up in a surreal adventure that mixes Western grit with medieval and even fantasy elements. But behind the bizarre storyline lay a streak of violence that censors found hard to ignore. Ambushes drag on in painful detail, brawls turn nasty, and executions are staged with unsettling precision. The U.S. release hacked away at several sequences to get a safer rating, and international distributors often cut the more surreal violent scenes altogether. Critics at the time were bewildered. Was this a parody? Was it serious? Or was it just an excuse to pile on spectacle that veered from outrageous comedy to grim cruelty? What makes Get Mean worth remembering is how unclassifiable it island. Unlike traditional spaghetti westerns, it didn't aim for grit alone. It mixed pulp, surrealism, and sudden brutality, leaving audiences unsure of whether to clap or cover their eyes. For censors, that confusion was a nightmare, because unpredictability made it harder to control. Today, Get Mean stands as one of the strangest relics of the spaghetti western era. It dared to take the genre off the map, and in doing so, it crossed the very line censors had spent years trying to draw. The Spikes Gang, 1974. When coming of age turns into coming face-to-face with despair. The Spikes Gang was marketed like a youthful adventure western, but what audiences got was a punch in the gut. Directed by Richard Fleischer, it follows three restless boys, played by Ron Howard, Gary Grimes, and Charles Martin Smith, who fall under the sway of veteran outlaw Lee Marvin. What starts as wide-eyed rebellion quickly slides into tragedy. The violence here isn't about body counts, it's about shattered innocence. Each robbery and ambush plays less like action and more like a slow-motion fall into darkness. Censors bristled at the unflinching way the film showed youthful characters caught up in a world of cruelty. Even trimmed, the final sequences, especially the fates of the boys, left audiences shaken. Television versions often gutted entire subplots to soften the blow, but the sense of doom remained. What makes the Spikes Gang so unnerving is its honesty. It strips away the fantasy of becoming an outlaw and shows instead the consequences: fear, guilt, and pain. Lee Marvin's presence only deepens the sense of inevitability, as if the boys were doomed from the moment they followed him. For censors, the problem wasn't just the violence, it was the message. This was no adventure. It was a cautionary tale so stark that some thought it too harsh for audiences to handle. Today, the film is remembered as one of the bleakest westerns of the 70 seconds. It dared to say the outlaw dream wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly. Cry Onion, 1975. Yes, even a comedy western landed in censorship trouble. Cry Onion, directed by Enzo G. Castellari and starring Franco Nero, was designed as a spoof of spaghetti westerns packed with slapstick, parodies, and outrageous gags. So how did it end up censored? The answer lies in its unexpectedly violent streaks that clashed with its comedic tone. At first glance, the movie looks silly. Characters duel with onions, absurd plots unfold, and the whole thing plays like a lampoon. But beneath the laughs, Castellari slipped in scenes that went harder than most audiences expected. Fights stretched on with exaggerated brutality, and some set pieces piled on a level of chaos that censors found jarring for what was billed as a comedy. Several European markets trimmed the violent slapstick, fearing that younger viewers would get whiplash from the sudden tonal shifts. Even in the U.S., distributors softened some of the nastier gags before release. It wasn't the blood that rattled censors, it was the way the film blended goofy humor with startlingly grim moments, leaving audiences unsure whether to laugh or wince. Cry Onion stands as proof that even parody westerns could cross the line. Instead of defanging the genre, Castellari sharpened it into a cartoon blade that cut a little too deep for comfort. What survives today is a reminder that censorship wasn't just about gore, it was about tone, and Cry Onion broke the rules by refusing to pick one mood. The Stranger and the Gunfighter, 1974, Kung Fu meets the Wild West. What could go wrong? The Stranger and the Gunfighter, also known as Blood Money, was a cross-cultural mashup starring Lee Van Cleef and martial arts star Lo Lee. On paper, it was a pulpy crowd-pleaser. On screen, it became another headache for censors. The premise is wild, a treasure map tattooed on women across the West, leading to a hunt that mixes martial arts showdowns with spaghetti western grit. But what made it controversial wasn't the quirky setup, it was the sheer level of violence. Every brawl is intense, with martial arts combat filmed in startling detail and western shootouts staged with the grim precision of an exploitation flick. European markets hacked away at several sequences, especially those where the martial arts brutality lingered too long. American television edits stripped out much of the violence altogether, leaving viewers with a disjointed treasure hunt story that barely resembled the theatrical cut. Critics were puzzled, but fans loved its audacity, a mashup that felt ahead of its time, even if it crossed every line censors had set. The Stranger and the Gunfighter proves how flexible the Western could be in the 70 seconds. It didn't just borrow from martial arts cinema, it fully embraced it, blending two traditions of on-screen violence into one unpredictable package. That unpredictability was exactly why regulators clamped down, and why fans today celebrate it as one of the wildest hybrids of its era. Valdez is Coming, 1971, Burt Lancaster with a rifle in hand and vengeance in his eyes. Valdez is Coming was more than just another gritty western. It was a film that rattled audiences with its raw portrayal of cruelty and justice. Based on Elmore Leonard's novel, it follows Valdez, a humble constable who's humiliated and left for dead by powerful ranchers. Instead of crawling away, he rises, and what follows is a relentless quest for payback. What made the film controversial wasn't just its violence, but the way that violence was used. Valdez isn't a superhuman hero. He's battered, scarred, and yet unyielding. The torture scenes, in particular, pushed censors to act. Prolonged sequences showing his suffering were trimmed for multiple releases, while U.S. distributors softened some of the grimmer shootouts to fit a more palatable rating. Audiences, however, couldn't shake the impact. Lancaster's performance gave weight to every bruise, every scar, and every carefully chosen moment of retribution. Critics called it both powerful and disturbing, with some praising its grit and others condemning it as excessive. Either way, the message was clear. This was no romanticized West. This was a world where cruelty had consequences, and justice came at a cost. Valdez's coming wasn't about glory, it was about endurance. And endurance, as censors discovered, could look a lot like brutality. California, 1977. The last gasp of spaghetti westerns came soaked in nihilism. California, directed by Michel Lupo, is often overlooked, but it remains one of the darkest entries in the genre's history. Set after the Civil War, it follows a former soldier drifting through a shattered landscape where greed and violence rule every encounter. What unnerved censors was the film's relentless bleakness. Shootouts aren't stylized, they're messy, cruel, and devastating. Innocents fall without warning, ambushes leave scars, and the West looks less like a place of opportunity than a graveyard of ideals. Critics noted how the film seemed almost allergic to hope. When California was distributed internationally, several countries cut down the most violent stretches, especially during chaotic ambush sequences. Even so, its reputation as a downbeat classic spread quickly. What makes California stand out is its sheer commitment to hopelessness. There are no clean victories here, only survival bought at terrible cost. For censors in the 70 seconds, that was too much honesty for mass audiences. For modern fans, though, the film feels eerily ahead of its time, a Western that saw the death of the genre coming and chose to go out swinging. California may not be as famous as Leone's epics or Fulci's shockers, but it deserves its place as one of the last great brutal Westerns that couldn't escape the scissors. So there you have it, 15 Westerns that blew past the line, leaving censors scrambling and audiences stunned. These weren't just shootouts on horseback, they were cinematic brawls with history itself, daring us to look at the West without its myths. Which one shocked you the most? Drop your pick in the comments, share this with a fellow film fan, and hit subscribe for more hidden gems. The frontier may be gone, but its shadows still ride.